Bona tarda. Benvolguts estudiants, professors, això que en dèiem la comunitat universitària. Us vull donar la benvinguda en nom de l'equip de Canal en aquest curs 2000-2001, any, com sabeu, a més del que és el nostre desè aniversari, en el que s'inscriu aquesta edició inaugural. I us dono la benvinguda amb un acte acadèmic, amb una lliçó que ens donarà el professor Alan Williams, dintre del que han sigut les tradicionals lliçons d'economia que, patrocinades per Andersen Consulting, han vingut informant el que són els inicis de curs d'aquests últims anys. Encara que el representant d'Andersen, Joan Pere Raurell, no hagi arribat encara, tot i que ens ha trucat que estava en el camí, continua havent-hi taxistes que no coneixen on és la Pompeu Fabra, malgrat ell no hi sigui, repeteixo, vull agrair públicament l'esponsorització que ens està fent Andersen Consulting per al finançament d'aquesta lliçó d'economia. Sense ja més preàmbuls, voldria presentar-vos el conferenciant. Alan Williams va néixer l'any 1928, és catedràtic d'Economia per la Universitat de York i doctorat per la Universitat de Princeton. Els primers articles que jo vaig llegir seus tenien a veure amb l'economia del benestar, amb el tema d'externalitats, recordo un article de l'American Economic Review sobre aquest tema, i el seu currículum acadèmic el desenvolupa amb posterioritat cap als camps més aplicats de l'anàlisi cost-benefici i l'avaluació de programes de política pública. En aquests moments, el professor Alan Williams és ja catedràtic emèrit de la Universitat de York i és molt conegut com a pioner en la introducció de la perspectiva econòmica a l'avaluació dels programes sanitaris. Dintre de la seva tasca investigadora recent, destaquen les contribucions, més recents han estat les contribucions en el camp de l'avaluació econòmica en l'establiment de prioritats dintre de les polítiques públiques. Ha estat el principal impulsor de la mesura d'output sanitari més utilitzada en l'actualitat. És l'anomenat anys de vida ajustats per qualitat, AVAX o QUALIS en terminologia anglesa, i ha estat considerat recentment com l'investigador amb l'article més influent en economia de la salut escrit per un europeu al llarg de les últimes dècades. En l'actualitat, ja retirat de la docència, segueix portant una intensa vida acadèmica, sobretot en el camp de l'ajuda de presa de decisions sobre com establir prioritats dins el sector sanitari a través dels estudis cost-efectivitat. Les seves teories actuals i més controvertides són les que tendeixen a afavorir una discriminació contra la gent gran o, com diu ell, en sentit més positiu, afavorir els joves, sempre que hi ha un procés d'establiment de prioritats. Més enllà d'identificar l'economia com la ciència de l'escassetat, això que aprenem des dels primers cursos, assignar recursos escassos, ell prefereix parlar sempre de l'economia com un instrument racional per atreure el màxim dels recursos disponibles, és a dir, aliviant de l'escassetat. I això el posa en un terreny molt franc amb els professionals sanitaris quan ells defensen que tracten d'aliviar les malalties Ell diu que l'economia està en el mateix front perquè tracta d'aliviar també l'escassetat. Al marge del text de la conferència d'avui que trobareu repartit a la sala, us recomano un text addicional publicat a Papeles d'Economia Espanyola número 76, ara farà 2 anys, traduït al castellà i dintre d'un monogràfic dedicat a l'economia de la salut. Professor Williams, the floor is yours.
Can we have that thing moved?
I will do.
Okay. I hope you'll excuse me if I sit down while I'm talking. It's one of the privileges of old age is that you can do as you like. 30 years ago, which looks to me like before most of you were born, I decided to dedicate the rest of my professional career to persuading the medical profession and others influential in the running of healthcare that economics is a serious intellectual discipline which could help them with the policy problems that they faced, and it was not just an annoying constraint that stopped them from doing all the good things they wanted to do, both at an individual and at a social level. Pardon me. By a serious intellectual discipline, I mean a systematic mode of thinking which has developed certain concepts and studied certain structural relationships which lead its practitioners to see the world in a distinctive way and to ask characteristic questions and to require certain kinds of data which are then interpreted in a characteristic way. Economics is essentially concerned with optimization subject to constraints, and especially when the constraints are resource constraints of some kind. Typical examples of the characteristic questions that economists ask are, what exactly are you trying to maximize? What are the constraints? What options are available? What will be the consequences? What will be the timing? And most important of all, are the benefits likely to be worth the sacrifices? And the typical data that are regarded as appropriate for answering these questions will be quantitative rather than qualitative, and in order to make things commensurable, all valuations are likely to be expressed in money terms, which does not necessarily mean that they will be market-generated values. These characteristics of economics as a discipline came from centuries of thinking about economic problems. That is, from thinking about economics as a topic. Economics as a topic focuses upon problems generated by the way the economic system works, or fails to work as we would like it to. Typical economic topics or problems are inflation, unemployment, efficiency in the production and distribution of goods and services, incentive or disincentive effects of taxation, and so on. But each of these economic topics could also be analysed from the viewpoint of other disciplines. For instance, inflation could be seen as a moral problem and viewed from an ethical standpoint, or as a threat to democracy and analysed from the viewpoint of political science, or as a sociological problem because of its consequences for family structures, or as a legal problem in the framing of enforcement of contracts, and so on. The point I wish to make is that there is no exclusive one-to-one relationship between a particular discipline and the problems it can be used to tackle. Just as disciplines other than economics can usefully be applied to economic topics, so the discipline of economics can be applied to topics that do not superficially appear to be economic topics at all, such as what is the best treatment for a national health service to offer to a patient with a particular disease. I'll come back to that controversial question later. But first of all, I want to draw an important distinction between two types of economics, the positive and the normative. Positive economics seeks to establish what is actually happening and where that will most likely lead under various assumptions. It focuses on essentially factual matters, though sometimes rather speculative ones, the conclusions of which can be empirically tested to find out whether or not they are false. There is much unresolved discussion as to whether the best test of a positive analytical apparatus is the realism of its assumptions, or the accuracy of its predictions, or its generalizability, or its intuitive transparency, by which I mean the avoidance of any mysterious black box approach. Normative economics, however, seeks to go one step further and to recommend what is the best thing to do, given what we understand from positive economics about the underlying relationships between policy instruments and policy targets. The test of a good normative analytical apparatus is a little different from that for a positive one, because we need to check that the assumed maximand and the assumed constraints are indeed those that are appropriate to the policy problem under investigation, and that the policy instruments that are required are in fact available, or could be available if required. A good predictive theory, on the other hand, doesn't need to contain any variable that could be used by policymakers as an instrument to bring about change. One of the great problems within economics is the way people slide unwittingly from positive to normative modes of thinking without ever realizing it. Consider the fundamental notion of efficiency. Is it a positive concept or a normative concept? It could be either. But when someone shows that situation A is more efficient than situation B, this is almost invariably interpreted as a recommendation to go for A rather than B. But that's only valid if maximising efficiency in the particular way in which it's defined for purposes of economic analysis, a point I'll come back to later, is actually what policymakers want to do. Now, I don't believe that that is what most policymakers want to do, as I hope to persuade you later. All I am urging upon you at this point is to examine carefully your own thinking and behaviour whenever you make the judgment that one situation is better than another situation, as opposed to simply observing that they are different in certain respects. So, let me now get back to my 30-year crusade to get people running healthcare systems to take economics seriously as an intellectual discipline. The first major obstacle that I encountered was the dismissive assertion from influential members of the medical profession that it would be immoral for any clinician to take costs into account when deciding what treatment to recommend to a patient. So the intrusion of hard-headed economics into a fine humanitarian area of human endeavour, such as medicine, was to be strenuously resisted on ethical grounds, and would I kindly get lost. Now, that was not a very encouraging start, so I started unpicking the ethical argument that it is the doctor's duty to do whatever is best for the patient in front of him or her, no matter what the cost. Here, initially, I perpetrated the sin that I just warned you against, namely, I confused the positive and the normative. The doctor's ethical argument is a normative assertion, but I tackled it in the first place by operating in the positive realm, observing what doctors actually do, with a view to demonstrating that they don't actually live up to their own ethical code. This was, in fact, quite easy to do, because doctors have many responsibilities beside treating the patient in front of them at any particular time. They will have other patients waiting for their skill and attention, whose interests they have to balance against those of the particular patient they are currently attending to. They have to take time out from treating patients to keep up to date with medical science. They may be engaged in research intended to benefit future rather than current patients. They may be involved in the training of new doctors. They have a practice to manage, staff to hire or fire, financial matters to sort out, and they also have their personal and family lives to lead. So they're constantly balancing the time and energy spent on each of these activities, one against another. In other words, they're considering the opportunity costs of each activity in terms of the foregone benefits from the other activities. It is a classic optimization problem, requiring equimarginal adjustments, which will depend on what each individual doctor is trying to maximize. But once there is more than one competing activity, they cannot possibly be ignoring the costs of whatever time they spend with the patient in front of them. And all that economists are saying is that if it's okay to consider opportunity costs with respect to your own time, it must also be okay to consider the opportunity costs with respect to all the other scarce healthcare resources, like hospital beds or drugs or nursing staff. But although showing that doctors don't behave according to their own supposed ethical code raises the suspicion that they don't actually believe in it, it doesn't address the issue of whether that code was the appropriate ethical code in the first place. And if not, what ethical code should replace it? That is the trap I initially fell into. I rescued myself from it by arguing that the reason why it would not be ethical to ignore the opportunity costs of providing whatever is best for the particular patient in front of the doctor at any one time is because in a resource-constrained system, and all systems are resource-constrained, any resources devoted to one patient are denied to other patients whose health will suffer as a consequence. So if the primary objective of a healthcare system is to improve the health of the whole population as much as possible, and if this is an ethical objective, which it clearly is, then again the equimarginal principle should apply, namely that you should behave in such a way as to ensure that the foregone health gain is the same for any redeployment of any scarce resource. And this foregone health gain will always be positive. So it requires constant consideration of the value of these opportunity costs to make sure that they do not exceed the value of the benefits. And the ethical position implied by the simple application of the equimarginal principle is that a given health gain should be regarded as of equal value no matter who gets it, which is a strong egalitarian position about how interpersonal comparisons of welfare should be made in this context. If policymakers wish to adopt some more complex ethical position about distributional justice, this can also be accommodated. But we shall always face opportunity costs and trade-offs, and it will never be ethical to ignore such costs and trade-offs. And that is the ethical basis of the economist's position, and it turns out to provide an ethical platform to support what most doctors actually do. Nominal adherence to the other code is then best seen as a marketing slogan designed to enhance the confidence of patients in their doctors. After all, people who ignore the consequences of their actions for innocent third parties are not acting ethically, they are acting fanatically. And fanaticism has no place in a humanitarian activity such as the provision of healthcare. So you'll appreciate why it was that last year I got a tremendous sense of achievement when the Medical Ethics Committee of the British Medical Association said, health professionals have an ethical duty to make the best use of available resources, and this means that hard decisions must be made. It is clear that doctors are not obliged to comply with patients' requests for treatment when they make inequitable demands on scarce resources. Note the key phrase, inequitable demands, which highlights the key role of distributive justice rather than of efficiency in this line of thinking. But long before I emerged with some modest sense of achievement from that battleground, I had run into another minefield, again over the meaning of costs, this time laid by accountants and finance officers in the healthcare system. This second and rather more unexpected group of opponents objected to my assertion that costs were sacrifices which would not necessarily show up in money terms. This, they said, was simply naive and unrealistic and typical of the kind of head-in-the-clouds propositions for which academic economists were notorious. They took the view that only money costs were real costs and that these other so-called costs were either ephemeral or irrelevant or both. Doctors' time is a real cost because the health service has to pay for it. But patients' time is not a real cost because it doesn't fall on anybody's budget. And since patients willingly give up their time to get treatment, it can't be a relevant consideration. They were not impressed by my argument that money is merely an artifice designed to control people's access to real resources. And what we have to do is look behind the veil of money to see what is actually happening. They flinched visibly when I pointed out that if it really was a shortage of money that was holding us back, we could easily print some, since paper and ink are both readily available and very cheap. I've so far found this gulf between accountants and economists unbridgeable, and the only way forward I can see is to reform the budgetary system in such a way that all real costs, in an economist's sense, do fall on somebody's budget, so that even accountants begin to see them as real costs. For instance, one of my favourite proposals for healthcare reform is to introduce a charge for the use of patients' time. I think it would revolutionise the way in which healthcare is provided. For most patients, there are things they would rather be doing than sitting around waiting to see a doctor. And they have no desire to be in hospital any longer than is absolutely necessary. I once suggested to a finance officer that cost per case could be reduced by shortening the length of stay, especially when patients were being kept in over a weekend because the doctor who could authorise their discharge didn't work on a Friday and wouldn't be in again until Monday. I was told that it was the extra days at the end of a patient's hospital stay, when not much was being done, that enabled the system to keep the cost per day down. And that if these low-cost days were replaced by the high-cost days generated by newly arrived patients, cost per day would shoot up and it would be impossible to balance the books. He thought a more efficient change would be to get the primary care sector to provide the drugs required for patients immediately after discharge from hospital, instead of supplying them from the hospital pharmacy, because although this would be more risky for patients and more costly to the health service as a whole, it would get these costs off his budget. Accountants' ideas about what is efficient and economists' ideas about what is efficient are clearly poles apart. Unfortunately, while economists and accountants are well aware of the great divide between us over whether costs are real sacrifices or merely money outlays, most members of the medical profession cannot tell the difference between accountants and economists. They then blame economists for the defects in the financial system, which economists have been struggling to rectify. So I gave up dealing with accountants and tackled the next problem, which was to try and disabuse people of the idea that economists are only interested in costs. I tried to persuade them instead that we are interested in the benefits as well, and especially on how benefits are valued. This generated hostility from a new quarter, namely the epidemiologists and clinical researchers whose professional lives were dedicated to the measurement of so-called hard endpoints in healthcare, like survival or tumour size, or blood pressure, or some other biomedical indicator of disease deterioration or improvement. They said that if economists want to be something more than cost accountants, which is how they perceived our role, and sustain a claim to have something useful to say about the value of improved health, then they'd better start by explaining what is wrong with the tried and trusted success criteria used for decades in clinical trials. This had to be tackled from within their own conceptual world, because arguing for willingness to pay as a test of the value of a treatment was not going to carry much weight in a system which had explicitly rejected that criterion in favour of the assessment of need. So my line of argument was rather different. I pointed out that taking as the indicator of success in a clinical trial a commonly used measure such as the 2-year survival rate carried with it the following value judgments. To survive for less than 2 years confers no benefit. Having survived for 2 years, further survival confers no extra benefit. It doesn't matter with what quality of life you survive, and the value of survival is the same for everybody. Similar observations concerning the crudity of most of the conventional professionally determined benefit measures in healthcare has led economists to champion a radically different concept, namely the quality-adjusted life year. This is based on the simple idea that if we can provide someone with an extra year of healthy life expectancy, that should count as 1 unit. But if the best we can do is to provide someone with an extra year when they will have difficulty moving about and be in some pain, then that should count as less than 1 unit. How much less than 1 unit will depend on how bad it is. Suppose we set being dead as equal in value to 0. Then we should find out how people rated different health states on a scale in which being healthy is rated at 1 and being dead is rated at 0, allowing people, if they wish, to rate some states as being worse than dead, that is, to assign negative values to them. But which people should we ask? The doctors and epidemiologists said that we should ask the patients. But which patients? The patients who are currently in the particular health state? Those who might find themselves in the health state? Or those who were in that health state in the past but are now out of it again? On ethical grounds, you might argue that everyone who is affected by a decision to provide or not to provide a particular treatment for a particular group of patients has the right to have their values considered. In an interdependent, resource-constrained system, every such decision potentially affects everybody. So what about the taxpayers who put up the money and made the sacrifices in other aspects of their living standards? Do they not have a right to be heard too? Each of us, as citizens, has mixed motives. As taxpayers, we want a reasonable set of priorities established so that our money is not wasted on treatments with high costs and little or no benefit. But when we're ill, we want the best that money will buy, providing it's other people's money, of course. So health economists have advocated eliciting the values of a representative sample of the whole population and then using the mean or median values of that group of people to generate the quality adjustments in QUALIS. If the objective of the healthcare system were solely to maximise the health of the population at large, then we would measure the incremental cost per QALY for each treatment and go for those treatments that have the best cost per QALY ratio. And this line of thinking has led to the creation of cost per QALY league tables for treatments and the associated recommendation that in the face of budget limitations, you should start with the most cost-effective things and work your way down the list until the money runs out. Only in that way will health for the whole population be maximised. But if policymakers think that the healthcare system also has important equity objectives as well, such as reducing inequalities in people's lifetime experience of health, they will want to give extra weight to the benefits that go to people whose expected lifetime QALYs are low, such as the permanently disabled or those with relatively short life expectancy compared with the norm for society. And that can be handled by devising equity weights so that a given health gain is no longer regarded as of equal value no matter who gets it, but of differential value depending on who gets it. Economic analysis is capable of a lot more sophistication than many people imagine. But there is still strong resistance from the clinical research community to substituting these generic preference-based measures of health, such as QALYs, for the specific indicators they are accustomed to employing within clinical trials. They resent the incursion of economists, who they imagine are solely motivated by a desire to cut costs, into benefit measurement and valuation, where economists are quite rightly seen as a very dangerous threat to the hitherto unchallenged authority of doctors in that territory. That earlier ironic question that I put, what is hard-headed economics doing in a fine humanitarian area of human endeavour such as medicine, comes up again, but this time with increased vehemence. This work on QALY measurement and valuation has got me into more trouble than anything else I have ever done, and the battle still rages fast and furious. But I gain comfort from knowing that I am right and they are wrong. But for some respite from all of this aggravation, I sought comfort and support from within economics itself. And this is where I encountered my fourth and most disheartening obstacle, namely the conventional wisdom of neoclassical welfare economics. According to this, individuals are to be regarded as the sole judges of their own welfare, and nothing is to go into judgments about social welfare except some aggregation of the welfare of individuals. If you add to these two propositions the further assertion that no interpersonal comparisons of welfare are to be permitted, even though everyone but economists make them every day, then you have the essence of the classical welfare economist's mantra, which is that one social situation is better than another if and only if at least one person is better off and no one is worse off than in the starting position, whatever that happens to be. Since there are virtually no circumstances in which a social change leaves nobody worse off, this rather useless proposition got modified and instead says that if it were possible for the gainers from any change to compensate the losers fully and still have some gains left, then the move would be a social improvement, even though the compensation is not actually paid. no attention is paid to who are the gainers and who are the losers, nor to how unjust the starting position might have been. So think about the following situation. Suppose that the gainers from a policy change are the rich old, like me, who might live a few extra years as the result of some policy, and the losers are poor, young tearaways who could be bribed into accepting a higher risk of death to make these improvements for me possible. Then, even though they end up facing the extra risks without any compensation, this is judged to be a social improvement. Do you think it's a social improvement? I hope not. If this were indeed what economics is all about, then perhaps doctors were right to reject it as unethical. But fortunately, not all economists espouse this ethically unacceptable welfarist philosophy, and very few European health economists do. Indeed, most European health economists work within a non-welfarist frame of reference within which the distribution of welfare within a society is to count, as well as its sum total. In health economics, the two primary objectives of policy are assumed to be to maximise population health and to reduce inequalities in the lifetime experience of health of the individuals who comprise that population. Health should, of course, be measured in quality-adjusted life years, and although it's well known that life expectancy of poor people is much lower than that of rich people, things are even worse when you take quality-adjusted life expectancy into account, because the people with the shortest life expectancy are also the people who suffer the most pain and disability during their lives. But if you go down this non-welfarist track, you have to face the problem that sometimes efficiency, which now means health maximisation, not Pareto optimality, efficiency may have to be sacrificed in the interests of equity. Or, to be more specific, we may have to settle for a reduced level of population health in order to reduce health inequalities within that population. Now, such trade-off problems are attractive research topics for economists, and with some Spanish colleagues, we'd recently tested the willingness of a representative sample of the Spanish population to sacrifice efficiency in the interests of equity. You may be interested to know that the median Spaniard out of our representative sample of about 1,200 people is indifferent between the following two situations. When the higher class people will live for 77 years and the lower class people for 72, or when the higher class people will live to be 75 and the lower class people live to be 72 and a half. Now, the important thing about that is that that implies that it is worth sacrificing 2 extra years of life expectancy for the better off group, even though it increases the life expectancy of the worst off by only 6 months. That is what the median Spaniard believes. Now, at the very least, this can be taken to be a strong argument for replacing the welfarist paradigm in economics with a non-welfarist one, which includes in the social welfare function both the distribution of welfare and a coefficient expressing the strength of people's collective aversion to different sorts of inequality. Doing so would greatly increase the relevance and acceptability of economic reasoning in a social policy context where inequalities are typically a big political issue. So my arrogant conclusion from all of this is that health economists are now amongst the leaders in a paradigm shift in economics that needs to spread as quickly as possible into the rest of the subject, and especially into macroeconomics, where the explicit specification of the relevant social welfare function is conspicuous by its absence, and normative judgments about optimal levels of this and that seem totally untouched by any systematic elicitation of the values of the people affected. Perhaps some of you younger and braver economists would be prepared to dedicate your professional lives to making non-welfarism the norm in economics, so that the welfarist position comes to be seen as a historical curiosity. Policy analysis by economists should, as a result, become much more closely attuned to the values of the societies we claim to serve, and the world will be a better place as a result. It's a pity I won't live to see the day, but I'll be watching you all from somewhere out there. Go to it. It's a daunting task, but you'll need a clear head and a thick skin, because it can be a very hostile environment at times. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, professor Williams. Com és tradicional, si hi ha alguna intervenció clarificatòria o alguna qüestió, obriríem un breu temps, donat lo tard ja de l'hora. Si algú vol demanar, si us plau.
I'm a little bit surprised that you say that traditional welfare economists is so hostile to your ideas, because what I see as most common way of thinking about welfare is taking, maximizing a social welfare function, which is not equivalent to these compensation criteria that you refer to. And if you look at what people do in optimal taxation, and maybe even now in macroeconomic, if you look a little bit in optimal monetary policy, where they start to take into account what is the welfare of the people, and then they are maximizing the sum of welfares, this is very much, I think, in the direction of what you want to do, and is not equivalent to using compensation criteria.
There is certainly a lot of work which departs from the strict Paretian world. But I still find people coming back and telling me that I'm not doing the theoretically correct thing because I've departed from it. And then when I say, but what I'm doing seems more relevant to the world, they say it has no theoretical justification and it's just ad hoc. And I guess you must have faced the same criticisms. And the trouble is that once you depart from the well-worked out theoretical propositions of classical welfare economics, you have no equally well worked out thing to put in its place. So we're vulnerable to criticism. And so long as we are then seen as outsiders who are pragmatically doing useful things, it's going to be very difficult to get that accepted as the conventional wisdom of economics. So that's my first point, that I think we who've stepped outside the framework are vulnerable. The second point I would make more specifically to what you said is that in health economics we've taken a great deal of effort when talking about optimal levels of this or incremental cost effectiveness ratios to elicit people's values. I have not seen that happening in the fields that you're talking about. Okay? There's a lack of willingness to substitute some kind of social aggregation of people's values about, for example, whether it's more important to have strong labour incentives and get people to work or allow people to have more leisure. What do we know about people's preferences between work and leisure? We infer them from their behaviour in a market which doesn't give people an opportunity to operate at an optimal point from their point of view. So I think far too much happens in that field that is in effect the analyst supposing the set of values to be what is convenient from an analytical point of view instead of trying to find out what they actually are, which is usually very inconvenient from an analytical point of view.
Alguna paraula més? Doncs, si no hi ha cap més paraula, tancar l'acte agraint de nou la sponsorització d'Anderson Consulting d'aquestes edicions d'Economia i a tots vosaltres per la paciència en aquest dia tan efervescent d'estar aquí compartint aquest temps amb tots nosaltres. Moltes gràcies.